We all have those moments, right? Where you feel like there's something more out there, something we can't quite grasp with our everyday senses. It's like a little itch of curiosity about the unseen world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's pretty natural to wonder about what lies beyond our immediate perception.
Well, today we're going to dive into one of those areas that tends to spark a lot of fascination and debate. Angels.
Oh, definitely a topic that gets people talking and thinking.
And honestly, what we're going to cover today might challenge some of those preconceived notions you might have about what angels are all about.
For sure. We're not dealing with those Hallmark card images here, are we?
Definitely not. What makes this deep dive so interesting is that we're drawing from some pretty rich source material. Stuff that really digs into the origins and evolution of the angel concept.
Right. And it's important to emphasize right off the bat that our primary lens here is rooted in Jewish tradition.
Right. So we're looking at the Bible.
The Bible for sure, but also Jewish mysticism. Kabbalah specifically.
Oh, yeah. Kabbalah.
Yeah.
Always a fascinating area.
And we'll be touching on some prophetic texts as well.
So we're dealing with a concept that has some serious historical and spiritual weight.
Yeah, it's not just something that popped up out of thin air.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. When we say angels, what's the first image that pops into your head? I'm guessing for a lot of people, it's those little chubby babies with wings. The kind you see on Christmas cards.
Yeah, pretty standard imagery, right? Little cherubs with the harps and the halos.
But our source material really challenges that common perception, doesn't it? It says angels are not those cute, adorable figures, but something far more awe-inspiring.
Oh yeah, no cute little angels here. The author's pretty adamant about that. They're pushing back against that whole cutesy image.
What they describe is beings that exist in higher dimensions. Beings that might actually be pretty fearsome and respectable if we were to ever encounter them.
Yeah, more respect than adorable, for sure. Think more along the lines of forces of nature, almost.
So we're not talking about something that's limited to our physical world, right? These are beings that operate on a whole different level.
Exactly. The material really emphasizes that angels aren't bound by the limitations of our material reality. It's suggesting they exist on a completely different plane.
Okay, so higher dimensions. That's a mind-bending concept right there. What does that even mean in this context? I mean, are they physical beings in these other dimensions or something else entirely?
Well, the text doesn't go into specific details about their form in those higher dimensions, but it does draw on some interpretations within Jewish mystical thought.
Which suggests?
Well, the idea is that angels could exist as pure spirit forms, as energy, or as something that we just can't even fathom from our current perspective.
Wow. Okay, so definitely not just flitting around with tiny wings. This is getting pretty complex.
Right. But it's worth noting that the Book of Enoch is referenced in the material, and that offers a really intriguing possibility. Enoch hints that if angels were to interact with our physical world, they might need to take on a physical form to do so.
So like putting on a temporary suit or something to be able to operate in our reality.
Yeah, something like that. It really makes you think about the nature of existence beyond what we normally experience.
For sure. So if we ditch that popular image of angels as these little winged creatures, what are they actually doing? What's their main function in this framework?
Well, the source material really emphasizes their role as intermediaries.
Between what and what?
Between the higher realms and our world.
Okay, so they're like messengers carrying information or energy from one realm to another.
Exactly. And that actually ties in with the Hebrew word for angel, malachim, which literally means messengers.
So communication is central to their function. They're like conduits of something.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it.
And does the material say anything about different types of angels? Like different messengers with different responsibilities?
Yes, it does. For instance, it mentions the Watchers from the Book of Enoch. They're depicted as a specific category of angels with unique tasks.
Okay, interesting. So not all angels are created equal, so to speak.
Right. They have different roles, different functions. The material even suggests that they might have varying lifespans.
Like some angels are around for a short time, while others exist for eons.
That's the idea, yeah. It's all very layered and complex.
This whole energy aspect of angels is really intriguing to me. It feels a bit more abstract than the messenger idea.
It is a bit more abstract, yeah. But what I find fascinating is how the material connects our actions to this creation of energy and how that links back to the concept of angels.
So how does that work? What's the connection?
Well, there's this ancient saying mentioned in the text about how even a blade of grass only grows because a messenger of the Creator is channeling energy to it.
So even the smallest things in nature are being influenced by these unseen forces.
Precisely. And the implication is that the entire universe, which can be seen as inherently unstable, is actually held together by these unseen forces.
Okay, that's a pretty profound thought. But how does that relate to us, to our actions?
Because the author is suggesting that every action we take creates a ripple of energy.
So it's like we're constantly putting out these little energetic vibrations.
Exactly. And those vibrations interact with the fabric of reality, influencing the world around us in ways we might not even fully grasp. It's like a constant dance of energy and intention.
Wow, so our choices aren't just neutral events. They have a real impact on the spiritual landscape.
That's the takeaway here, yes. Our actions have consequences that extend beyond the physical realm. It's all very interconnected.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really makes you consider the weight of your choices, doesn't it?
It does. Now this leads us to something pretty central in Kabbalah, the concept of the infinite light.
Ah, yes. Ein Sof in Hebrew.
And this is understood to be the source of everything, the creator.
Right. But the text emphasizes that the Ein Sof is so utterly beyond our comprehension that we can't even begin to grasp it directly.
It's like trying to look directly at the sun. It's too overwhelming for our human senses.
That's a great analogy. We need something to filter that light, to help us understand it without being completely blinded.
And that's where angels come in.
Exactly. They act as intermediaries, allowing us to connect with those higher realms without being overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of it all. They're like transformers, stepping down the voltage of that infinite energy.
That's such a helpful visual. So they're like the lenses through which we can glimpse something of the divine.
Yeah, and the material even points to the example of Enoch, who was said to have been transformed into the angel Metatron.
Talk about a promotion.
Right, and Metatron is often depicted as this powerful intermediary figure, a kind of celestial scribe or record keeper.
It really underlines this whole idea of angels serving as bridges between different realms of existence.
It does. And the text includes some descriptions of angels that really emphasize their immense scale.
Oh yeah, like what?
Well, there's one description of an angel whose finger is said to span the distance from Earth to the moon.
Whoa.
Yeah, pretty mind-boggling stuff. It really challenges our limited perception of size and scale.
It makes you wonder how we could even begin to comprehend something like that.
Right, and the material actually addresses that. It suggests that information from these higher dimensions can appear as complete gibberish to us because of our limited perspective.
So it's like trying to explain a three-dimensional object to someone who can only perceive two dimensions.
Exactly. They might see a series of changing shapes, but they wouldn't grasp the true form of the object.
And that's why the prophetic visions we see in the Bible can be so difficult to interpret.
Yes, because they're essentially trying to translate something from a higher dimension into our limited human language and understanding.
It makes those prophets seem even more impressive. They were trying to make sense of something that was fundamentally beyond their grasp.
The text even points out that the prophets often struggled to understand earthly matters, let alone these complex heavenly visions.
It's a good reminder that we're dealing with something way beyond our everyday understanding here.
It's a whole different level of reality, and that's something the author really stresses. We need to be cautious when venturing into this kind of spiritual territory.
I mean, it sounds like it could be pretty dangerous if you're not prepared. The text actually issues some pretty strong warnings, doesn't it?
It does. There's a real emphasis on the potential dangers of trying to communicate with high-level spiritual beings before you've got a solid spiritual foundation.
Like, you need to do your homework first, get your own house in order.
Exactly. Because the material mentions some cautionary tales, stories about individuals who experienced severe mental instability after trying to summon angels or spirits without the proper understanding.
So it's like playing with fire.
Yeah, I think that's a fair analogy. It even references a supposed hospital in Israel specifically for those who went astray in these kinds of practices.
That's pretty intense. It sounds like they're saying it's not something to be taken lightly.
Not at all. And the author expresses skepticism about whether most people in their current state could even handle direct communication with high-ranking angels.
So what's the more grounded, safer approach?
Well, the text stresses the importance of grounding yourself in the material world first. Working on yourself, your weaknesses, your character.
So get your own life in order before you start trying to chat with angels.
Yeah, that's the general idea. Manage your earthly life responsibly before delving into those deeper spiritual practices.
Makes sense. But the material also talks about this fascinating concept of our own actions, creating our own angels, right?
Right. It introduces the idea that our actions, whether good or bad, can manifest as angels that either support us or accuse us.
So it's like we're constantly creating these spiritual entities that reflect our choices.
In a way, yes. The text suggests that good deeds create good angels that might speak in your favor in a future judgment, while bad deeds create, well, the opposite.
It's like a spiritual cause and effect.
Precisely. And it ties back into the idea of those divine beings observing us, constantly recording our actions.
It really makes you think about the impact of your choices, both in this life and potentially beyond.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that responsibility.
Now, the author also seems to have some strong opinions about contemporary spiritual movements, especially when it comes to things like the New Age movement and the whole channeling phenomenon.
Oh, yeah. The author definitely doesn't hold back there.
There's a pretty critical stance towards those who claim to be channeling angelic beings.
For sure. The author suggests that true prophets operate on a completely different level than your typical channelers.
So they're not buying the whole "I'm channeling Archangel Michael" thing.
Not really. They point to the awe and reverence that the prophets of old displayed when they interacted with genuine angels. Like Ezekiel, for example, who felt completely unworthy in the presence of an angel.
Which connects to that idea that no one has actually seen the face of the Creator except for Moses' brief glimpse of his glory.
Right. And the text uses that to emphasize the immense distance and absolute holiness of the divine.
So it's not something you just casually drop in on for a chat.
Definitely not. The author also brings in the New Testament and the apostolic letters to highlight the role of angels as intermediaries.
Like when Moses received the law on Mount Sinai. There were angels involved there, right?
Exactly. And the text focuses on this vivid image of the seraphim, those angels with wings covering their eyes and feet.
What's the significance of that imagery?
It's meant to symbolize profound reverence, the idea that no created being can fully stand before the Creator's holiness.
It's almost like they're shielding themselves from the sheer intensity of that divine presence.
That's a great way to put it. The text also touches on the idea that even the most righteous individuals can barely stand before the Creator, while the unrighteous will simply perish.
It paints a pretty powerful picture of the divine. It's not this warm and fuzzy, all-loving being that we sometimes hear about.
It's a lot more complex and awe-inspiring than that, and the author really urges us to approach these things with a deep sense of discernment and to really study the foundational texts before making any judgments.
So it's about going back to the source, not just accepting what's popular or trendy in spirituality.
Exactly. Now, the material also delves into this idea of the perceived silence of the divine. The fact that we don't seem to have prophets or direct communication from the Creator in our times.
But like God's gone quiet.
Yeah, that's a common sentiment. But the text offers a really interesting perspective on this. It points to the book of Genesis and suggests that incredibly deep meanings, perhaps even infinite possibilities, are encoded within it.
Like some kind of secret code.
Yeah, what the author calls permutation codes. And the idea is that human choices, through our free will, are what ultimately activate these codes and shape the world.
So it's not that God's not speaking, it's that the message is already there and it's up to us to unlock it through our choices.
That's the idea. We're not just passive recipients. We have an active role in shaping reality.
It's almost like a cosmic choose-your-own-adventure book.
Right. The path unfolds based on the choices we make.
But that also puts a lot of pressure on us, doesn't it? I mean, how do we know we're making the right choices?
That's where discernment comes in. And the author acknowledges that it's incredibly difficult these days with all the information overload we're constantly bombarded with.
Especially online. There's so much conflicting information about spirituality and everything else.
Exactly. It's like drinking from a fire hose.
So how do we sift through all that noise? What does the author suggest?
Well, they say that a good way to gauge the validity of any spiritual teaching is to look at the fruits of the person teaching it. How are they living their life? What are their actions reflecting?
So it's not just about what they say, it's about how they walk the walk.
Precisely. Actions speak louder than words. And the author also warns against deceptive spirits that might try to masquerade as angels of light.
So not every spiritual experience is necessarily a good one.
Exactly. Discernment is crucial. Now, the author also draws a distinction between different approaches to spirituality. They contrast the emphasis on supernatural experiences in some Christian denominations with the traditional Jewish focus on studying the Torah and developing rational understanding.
So more emphasis on intellectual rigor and less on emotional highs.
I think that's a fair assessment. There's even a quote mentioned, "Those who believe everything are fools." It's about using your intellect to critically examine things.
And they also caution against over-relying on your feelings.
Yes, because the Torah actually depicts the human heart as being potentially deceitful. It can lead us astray if we're not careful.
So follow your heart isn't always the best advice.
Not necessarily, because sometimes what we think we're feeling is actually just our ego or our desires masquerading as something deeper.
And that can lead to disillusionment.
For sure, it can create all sorts of self-created illusions that ultimately lead to disappointment, even depression.
So this circles back to the idea that true communication with the highest realms is probably not something most of us are prepared for at this point.
That's the suggestion, yeah. We need to do the inner work first. And the author even raises the possibility of self-deception or even negative influences in those supposed high-level communications.
So you might think you're talking to an angel, but it could be something else entirely.
That's a possibility that's definitely raised. And what's interesting is that the text mentions the concept of energy bodies, something found in ancient traditions like Chinese medicine and Ayurveda.
So this isn't just a New Age idea. These ancient cultures had their own ways of understanding these unseen energies.
Exactly. They had their own frameworks for understanding how these subtle energies operate.
And the author seems to be suggesting that we can learn something from those older traditions.
I think so, yes. There's this idea of humans as microcosms, reflecting the macrocosm, which is found in many ancient cultures.
So what happens within us is reflected in the world around us.
That's the idea. And it leads to this really powerful concept that healing yourself is essentially healing the world.
So it's about focusing inward, not outward.
Exactly. The author is advocating for that deep inner work. They highlight the Torah's teaching. Repair yourself. You repair your universe. That's presented as the key to improving the world around us.
So trying to fix external problems without first addressing your own inner flaws is kind of pointless.
That's the argument. There's even this saying, one who cannot sweep his own house cannot sweep the world. It's about getting your own house in order first.
So where do we even begin with all this? I mean, there's so much information out there.
It can be overwhelming, for sure. But the text suggests that the most valuable guidance might be found in the ancient wisdom that's been passed down through generations.
So go back to the source, the original teachings.
That's the idea. And the author acknowledges that language itself is limited when it comes to fully conveying these deep spiritual truths.
It's like trying to describe the ocean to someone who's never seen it. Words can only do so much.
Precisely. And ideally, the text suggests you'd have a direct mentor, a truly enlightened individual to guide you. But those individuals are pretty rare these days.
Like trying to find a needle in a haystack. But the material does mention one group, the Essenes, right?
Yeah. They're brought up as a historical example of a Jewish sect that was incredibly rigorous in their spiritual practices and their focus on both physical and spiritual purity.
So they were like the spiritual athletes of their time.
In a way, yeah. And the author also brings up the New Testament and how it relates to these older traditions.
So how do they see those two things fitting together?
Well, they point out that the New Testament presents a more demanding ethical standard than some interpretations of the Old Testament.
Like it raises the bar.
That's the suggestion. And the author links the decline in morality and spirituality in more recent times to the perceived silence of the divine and the destruction of the temple.
So it's like a turning point in history where things started to shift in a different direction.
Yeah, and the argument is that we already have sufficient prophetic texts. It's not that we need more, it's that we need to really understand and apply what we already have.
We need to go back and study those foundational teachings.
That's the key. And the author stresses that we need to have a solid understanding of earthly matters before we can even begin to grasp those deeper spiritual truths.
It's like building a house. You need a strong foundation before you start adding the upper floors.
Precisely. Now, when it comes to modern spiritual practices, the author has some pretty strong opinions.
Especially about channeling.
Oh yeah. They're very cautious about that. They talk about the danger of truth mixed with falsehood, which they compare to spiritual poison.
So it's not always easy to tell what's genuine and what's not.
It's not. They use this really powerful analogy of the serpent's deception in the Garden of Eden.
So we need to be very discerning about what we accept as truth.
Very discerning. And they advocate for what they call pure spiritual milk, which is understood to be the original Hebrew texts without any later alterations.
So go back to the source, the unadulterated teachings.
Exactly. And the author highlights the historical reverence that the Jewish people have for the Creator in the Torah. They point out that there's a deep reluctance to alter those texts in any way.
They're seen as sacred and inviolable.
Right. But then the author contrasts that with some Christian traditions, which they see as having strayed from those original Jewish roots.
So they see a divergence in those two paths.
Yes, and they express concerns about the changes that have been made to the Bible over time.
And they even bring up Yeshua's, Jesus' own words, right, about how the Torah will never be abolished.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the enduring value of those original teachings.
So what's the author's perspective on the New Testament then?
Well, they definitely offer a critical perspective. They even suggest that there might be a future revelation that will clarify its true form.
So they're not rejecting it outright, but they're saying there's more to the story.
Yeah. They talk about the historical shift from Torah-based teachings to the development of Roman Catholic traditions and the incorporation of elements from pagan cultures.
So there's a merging of different influences.
Right. And they encourage listeners to do their own research into that historical and theological context. Don't just take things at face value.
So what's the core message here for the listener who's trying to navigate their own spiritual path?
The emphasis is on taking personal responsibility. You're responsible for your own spiritual journey, and it's important to align yourself with what you understand to be the Creator's will, not just your personal preferences.
It's not about creating your own personalized spirituality.
No, it's about seeking truth, wherever that may lead. And the text explicitly states that the Creator did not advocate for forced conversion.
So no one should be coerced into believing something they don't truly accept.
Exactly. It's about genuine, heartfelt belief. And the material really stresses the importance of self-reflection, constantly working on correcting your own flaws, and being mindful of your words and thoughts.
So it's about the inner work, the constant process of refining yourself.
Yes, and they connect global and personal difficulties to the collective manifestation of negative human energy.
So our negativity has a real impact on the world around us.
That's the idea. And the author advocates for what they call switching judgment. Instead of focusing on criticizing others, focus on improving yourself.
To be the change you want to see in the world.
Essentially, yes. And they reiterate the belief that humanity might not be ready for those really advanced spiritual teachings.
It's like we need to master the basics before we can move on to the more complex stuff.
Exactly. They also highlight how rare it is to find individuals who actually live up to those really high spiritual standards set by figures like the Essenes or Yeshua.
It's a high bar.
It is.
Right.
And the author stresses that actively following the Creator's commandments is more important than simply knowing his name.
So it's about action, not just intellectual assent.
Precisely. And they reference Psalm 119, which is all about the value and importance of the Torah.
So the conclusion really calls for a commitment to personal transformation, doesn't it?
It does. It's about constantly examining yourself, cultivating your soul, and transforming negative patterns of thought and speech.
Because those negative thoughts and words have a real impact.
A huge impact. The author talks about the power of words to either build up or destroy, and the importance of controlling your tongue.
It's like that old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Except, words can be incredibly hurtful.
They can. And the author criticizes the divisiveness and harshness that you sometimes see in religious communities. They're calling for a redirection of that energy towards personal growth instead of outward conflict.
So focus on your own beam before you try to remove the speck from your brother's eye.
That's a great way to put it. And they share a teaching from a rabbi about how important your attitude and delivery are, even when you're speaking what you believe to be the truth.
So it's not just about what you say, but how you say it. Precisely. Tone and intention matter. And the text links the rejection of core Torah principles to becoming enslaved to your own emotions and desires.
So you become a slave to your own ego.
That's the idea. And they draw a parallel between dogmatically clinging to your own beliefs and the historical violence of the Crusades.
Pretty strong comparison.
It is. And the author encourages a more humble approach to understanding Scripture. Don't assume you have it all figured out.
Be willing to question your own interpretations.
Exactly. And they suggest comparing yourself to the descriptions of the scornful, the wicked, and the foolish in the Torah.
Ouch. No one wants to see themselves in those categories.
Right. It's about being honest with yourself about your own shortcomings. And the author even shares a bit of their own personal journey, admitting that they used to be arrogant and aligned with behaviors they now understand as negative.
So they've been on their own path of transformation.
They have. And they express a desire to help others avoid those same pitfalls.
To share what they've learned along the way.
Exactly. And they acknowledge the incredible benefit of the internet for conducting independent research.
It's an amazing tool for learning, but it also comes with its own challenges.
For sure. But the author emphasizes that ultimately you're responsible for your own spiritual life. You have to do the work.
You can't just outsource your spirituality to someone else.
Exactly. And they express this belief that a sincere heart will be guided to truth as long as you're willing to let go of your biases and preconceived notions.
So be open to being wrong. Be willing to change your mind.
That's a big part of it. And the author reaffirms their belief that the Creator's teachings are still relevant today. They haven't been abolished or superseded.
They're timeless principles.
They are. And this deep dive concludes with a call to action, a call to constant self-renewal, to cultivate your soul and to live in alignment with those core teachings.
It's about actively working towards a more hopeful future, both for ourselves and for the world.
Exactly. It's about that inner transformation that ripples outward.
So, as we wrap up this fascinating exploration, it's clear that the concept of angels is far more complex and nuanced than those popular images we often see.
It is. And it's rooted in these deep traditions that offer a very different perspective on what these beings are and what their role is in the grand scheme of things.
We've seen how the material challenges those common perceptions, presenting angels as powerful, high-dimensional beings that serve as messengers and conduits of energy.
Right. It's a perspective that really expands our understanding of the unseen world.
We've also considered the warnings about the potential dangers of approaching spiritual matters without proper grounding, and the profound impact that our own actions have on the spiritual landscape.
It's about taking responsibility for our choices and recognizing that those choices have consequences beyond what we might immediately perceive.
And ultimately, this deep dive brings us back to the core principle of inner transformation. The idea that true change starts within each of us and ripples outward, influencing the world around us.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive observers in this cosmic drama, we're active participants, and our choices matter.
That's a powerful takeaway. So, as a final thought for our listeners, I'd encourage you to reflect on your own perceptions of the unseen world.
Yes, consider how this perspective, one that emphasizes inner work, engagement with those foundational texts, and discernment in spiritual matters, might reshape your own understanding of these concepts.
Maybe it'll spark a curiosity to explore those rich traditions of Jewish mysticism, or to dig deeper into the historical context of the texts we've discussed.
Whatever path you choose, I think the key is to approach it with an open mind, a sincere heart, and a willingness to question your assumptions.
Beautifully said. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking.
And keep transforming.